Ah, look at what they can't stop replaying. Yeah, that moment. The one they thought would pass quietly. The one they assumed would dissolve into nothing like all the other times you were expected to stay in your place. The one where the room was supposed to move on without resistance, without interruption, without friction. You were meant to remain the unspoken name, the convenient silence, the easy omission. But something happened, didn't it? Something shifted, something snapped into place so cleanly, so decisively, so completely out of alignment with their expectations that it sent a shock through the entire structure they thought they controlled. And now they're asking questions they were never supposed to ask. Not about you directly, about the room, about loyalty, about authority, about who just crossed a line they didn't even realize was being guarded. Someone powerful, someone who rarely intervenes, someone who understands exactly how these dynamics work, watched the moment unfold and felt their internal model break because someone went to war for you in that room, not loudly, not emotionally, not impulsively, calmly, deliberately, with precision. And the words that followed weren't admiration, they weren't praise, they were confusion sharpened by fear. Why would anyone do that? Why would someone risk position, standing, leverage for you? Because what just happened didn't fit the rules they rely on. It didn't fit the hierarchy they enforce. It didn't fit the quiet agreement that certain people are safe to overlook, safe to diminish, safe to sacrifice, without consequence. You see, they had you mapped out, didn't they? Your role, your ceiling, your relevance. They knew where you belonged in the room, which was nowhere that mattered. They thought your silence meant acceptance. They thought your restraint meant weakness. They thought your distance meant disengagement. They thought they understood the limits of how much weight your name could carry when spoken aloud. And for a long time, maybe you let them think that. Maybe you stayed quiet. Maybe you didn't correct the narrative. Maybe you allowed them to believe you were alone, unsupported, unprotected, that you didn't have anyone willing to step into the fire on your behalf. And then it happened. That one moment, that interruption they didn't plan for, that defense they didn't see coming because they were too busy watching the version of you they thought they had already neutralized. The shift was immediate. You could feel it. The air changed. The confidence in the room wavered. The unspoken hierarchy glitched. Because when someone speaks up for a person who isn't even fighting for themselves, it exposes something dangerous. It reveals that the power balance they rely on is conditional, fragile, dependent on compliance. And the moment someone refuses to comply, the entire structure starts to wobble. Someone somewhere, someone with authority, someone who understands how influence actually moves, thought the same thing at the same time. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not for you. Not like this. Let's be very clear about something. That moment wasn't about fairness. It wasn't about kindness. It wasn't about morality. It was about alignment. Someone recognized something in you that didn't need defending loudly, only acknowledged correctly. And that recognition shattered the framework the room was operating under. Because when you build power on the assumption that certain people will always stay quiet, always absorb pressure, always accept erasure, and someone violates that assumption, it's not just uncomfortable, it's destabilizing. You became the variable they couldn't control without realizing it existed. Not because you spoke, but because someone else decided you were worth interrupting the script for. They thought your story was already written, that your chapter had ended somewhere earlier, quietly, without ceremony. They convinced themselves your absence from the conversation meant irrelevance. They told themselves that if you mattered, someone would have said something sooner. They used that silence to justify everything that followed. And then in one precise moment, that justification collapsed. Because silence wasn't the truth. It was just unchallenged until it wasn't. Now here's where the discomfort deepens. The person who spoke up didn't do it out of loyalty, the way they understand loyalty. It wasn't tribal. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't personal history. It was recognition of trajectory, of pattern, of something that doesn't announce itself early but becomes obvious to those who know how to read rooms properly. That's what really unsettles them. Because if that person saw it, others might have too. And if others saw it, then the assumption that you were safe to dismiss was wrong long before that moment. They're retracing conversations now, replaying side glances, reinterpreting pauses, trying to locate the exact point where the balance tipped without them noticing. Because power hates being surprised, especially when the surprise comes not from rebellion, but from realignment. You didn't storm the room. You didn't force a confrontation. You let gravity do the work. You let the truth surface on its own timeline. And when it did, someone else took responsibility for acknowledging it. That's the part they can't neutralize. If you had defended yourself, they could frame it as ego. If you had argued, they could call it insecurity. If you had demanded respect, they could paint you as difficult. But you didn't. Someone else did the speaking. Someone whose voice carries weight they can't easily dismiss. Someone who doesn't gain anything obvious by standing up for you. And that absence of motive terrifies people who survive by tracking incentives. So now they're scrambling to reassert order. Quietly, subtly. They're adjusting language, softening edges, reframing the narrative to make it seem like nothing really changed. But it did. They know it did. Because the room remembers. Rooms always remember moments like that. Moments when the script breaks and no one knows who's supposed to speak next. Moments when the hierarchy hesitates. Moments when the wrong person suddenly looks protected. You should understand something about these environments. They are not ruled by rules. They are ruled by permission. Who is allowed to speak? Who is allowed to challenge? Who is allowed to matter? And permission is rarely written down. It's enforced through silence, through repetition, through people learning exactly how far they can go before being corrected. When someone goes to war for you without asking, without signaling, without hesitation, it sends a message that permission has shifted. And shifts like that don't reverse easily. They're watching you differently now. Even if they pretend not to be. Even if they never mention it again. Because now there's a question hovering over every interaction. Who else would step in? Who else is watching? What don't we know about this person that we assumed we did? And those questions create distance, caution, hesitation, the kind that weakens systems built on confidence and momentum. Here's the irony they're choking on. You didn't plan this moment in the way they understand planning. You didn't orchestrate it socially. You didn't lobby for support. You didn't manipulate alliances. You simply became someone worth defending without needing to ask. And that's a level of leverage that can't be fabricated. It can only be earned through consistency, restraint, and a refusal to perform desperation. They keep circling back to the same thought, even if they don't articulate it clearly. If this person was worth that kind of intervention, what else have we misread? What else have we underestimated? What other assumptions are we operating on that might collapse the same way? Because power doesn't fear opposition as much as it fears blind spots. and you just exposed one. What makes this even more unsettling is that you're not capitalizing on the moment publicly. You're not posturing. You're not changing your behavior to signal victory. You're not reminding anyone what happened. You're moving exactly the same way you were before, calm, unbothered, focused. And that consistency tells them something they don't want to admit. This wasn't a fluke. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a one-off. This was alignment finally becoming visible. They're realizing now that your restraint wasn't submission. It was selectivity. That your silence wasn't absence. It was observation. That your patience wasn't weakness. It was timing. You didn't need to speak in that room because the moment required someone else's voice. And that tells them you're operating on a level where outcomes don't depend on constant assertion. They depend on positioning. Now here's where the unease turns into something sharper. They can't confront you about it without exposing themselves. They can't ask why someone defended you without revealing that they believed you didn't deserve it. They can't challenge the shift without drawing attention to the instability it exposed. So they sit with it. They adjust around it. They carry it forward into future decisions in subtle ways. And every adjustment is an admission that the balance of power has changed. You should know this, too. When someone goes to war for you in a room like that, it's never just about the past. It's about the future. It's about trajectories colliding. It's about recognizing who will matter later and choosing sides before it becomes obvious to everyone else. Someone made that choice. Quietly, publicly enough to be felt. And now the clock is ticking on a reality they can't stop from unfolding. Because moments like that don't fade. They echo. They influence how names are spoken, how opportunities are framed, how risks are calculated. You didn't walk out of that room elevated in title. You walked out recalibrated in perception. And perception is where real power lives. They wanted you small, contained, predictable. They wanted you grateful for scraps of acknowledgement. They wanted you dependent on their approval. And now they're forced to contend with the fact that you don't need any of that. That your position doesn't hinge on their consensus. That your relevance doesn't require their permission. Someone else already made that clear for them. And the most destabilizing part, this wasn't the climax. It was an early signal, a preview, a quiet confirmation that the structure they're relying on is already under strain. Because when one person is willing to step forward, others start reconsidering their silence. When one rule is broken without consequence, the rest start looking optional. And when one person is recognized as worth protecting, the story around them begins to change whether anyone wants it to or not. They're not saying it out loud yet, but they're thinking it. That moment wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a shift they're not ready to navigate. Because now they have to move, knowing the room isn't what it used to be. Knowing you're not who they thought you were. Knowing that someone is willing to draw a line they didn't expect to be drawn. And as they sit with that realization, adjusting, recalibrating, pretending everything is normal, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The next move isn't going to come from the same place the last one did. And this time, they won't be able to pretend they didn't see it coming. Here's the part that's quietly hilarious if you know how these rooms actually work. Everyone is acting calm, everyone is nodding, everyone is speaking in neutral tones like nothing has shifted. But internally, they're spiraling, because the rules they depended on just proved optional. And once a rule becomes optional, it's already dead. They don't know how to function in environments where silence isn't guaranteed, where compliance isn't automatic, where someone might intervene at any moment without warning. They built their confidence on predictability, and predictability just walked out the door with that one sentence spoken on your behalf. Now they're trying to locate the source of the disruption, not you. You're the outcome. They're trying to figure out who went to war for you and why. Because power doesn't fear opposition nearly as much as it fears alliances it didn't authorize. The question bouncing around the room isn't, was that appropriate? It's who else would do that? And that question spreads fast. It infects decisions. It slows momentum. It turns every interaction into a risk assessment. Suddenly, people are choosing words more carefully, watching reactions, testing boundaries with half steps instead of full strides. They're also running a secondary calculation they'll never admit to. If someone was willing to step in like that, what does it say about you that they missed? What does it say about their judgment, their perception, their supposed ability to read the room? Because here's the uncomfortable truth they're brushing up against. People don't go to war for liabilities. They don't stake credibility on someone they think is weak, unstable, or expendable. That defense wasn't charity. It was a signal. And signals like that ripple far beyond the moment itself. This is where the humor turns dark if you're paying attention. The same people who once dismissed you are now scrambling to position themselves closer to neutrality. Not support, not alliance, neutrality. Because neutrality feels safer when the ground is moving. They're not apologizing. They're not acknowledging the shift directly. They're just adjusting behavior in small, almost comical ways. Slightly kinder tones, sudden interest, convenient amnesia about previous assumptions. It would be funny if it wasn't so predictable. And you're not reacting at all. That's the part that's driving them insane. You're not basking. You're not leveraging the moment socially. You're not changing how you show up to signal victory. You're not reminding anyone what happened. You're letting the silence do the work again. But this time, it's a different kind of silence. This one is heavy, charged, full of implications. It's the silence of someone who doesn't need to prove they're protected because the protection already revealed itself. They're starting to understand something they really don't like. That the defense didn't come from loyalty built over years of social grooming. It came from respect built through observation. Someone watched how you move, how you operate, how you don't collapse under pressure, how you don't perform insecurity for sympathy, how you don't beg for relevance. And they decided, quietly, that letting the room misread you any longer was inefficient. That's the kind of reasoning that terrifies people who rely on dominance through optics rather than substance. So now the room is haunted by a ghost question. If you weren't worth defending before, why are you now? And the only answer that makes sense is the one they don't want to face. You didn't suddenly become something. You always were. They just weren't paying attention because they were too busy managing appearances. That realization hits hard because it exposes a deeper flaw. Their system doesn't identify real leverage early. It identifies compliance. It identifies noise. It identifies people who perform importance loudly enough to be seen. You didn't do that. You let time do its thing. You let patterns reveal themselves. You let results accumulate quietly. And when the moment came, someone else recognized the value before the room could erase it again. That's not luck. That's inevitability finally surfacing. And inevitability is impossible to argue with once it becomes visible. Now they're dealing with the fallout. Subtle, but real. Decisions are being second-guessed. Conversations are being revisited. People are wondering who's watching them the way that person watched you. Because if you slipped past their radar, who else might be doing the same? The room has lost its sense of omniscience, and that loss creates paranoia, disguised as professionalism. There's also something else happening beneath the surface, something even more destabilizing. The defense wasn't emotional, it wasn't dramatic, it was clean, almost boring. And boring disruptions are the worst kind. They don't give you something obvious to fight. You can't accuse it of bias or overreaction. You can't dismiss it as theatrics. It just sits there, undeniable, like a data point that refuses to go away. And every time someone tries to move forward as if nothing happened, it's there in the background, quietly contradicting the old narrative. They're realizing now that the power dynamic didn't glitch because of you. It glitched because of what your presence forced someone else to acknowledge. And once that acknowledgement exists, the room can't return to pretending you're invisible. They can try. They will try. But it won't work the same way, because now invisibility would require active effort, and effort reveals intent. Here's where the chaotic part creeps in. They're starting to overcorrect. People who never noticed you before are suddenly hyper-aware. People who never spoke to you are suddenly polite. People who once dismissed your ideas are suddenly curious. It's awkward, transparent, almost embarrassing, like watching a system try to patch itself in real time while pretending nothing broke. And the more they try to smooth it over, the more obvious the fracture becomes. You can feel the room stretching now, can't you? Trying to accommodate a reality it wasn't designed for. Trying to hold you in a category that no longer fits. You're not the problem they managed. You're not the variable they minimized. You're something else now in their perception. A risk, a wild card, a reminder that their control was never as absolute as they believed. And that realization doesn't inspire confidence. It inspires caution. What really rattles them is that the person who spoke up didn't need to explain themselves. They didn't justify their stance. They didn't soften the impact. They said what needed to be said and let it land. That kind of authority doesn't argue. It declares, and declarations shift gravity whether people like it or not. The room adjusted because it had to, not because it wanted to. Now imagine being someone who built their influence on being the loudest voice, the most confident presence, the unchallenged narrator. Imagine realizing that one calm sentence from someone else can undo years of quiet positioning. That's the fear they're sitting with now. Not fear of you directly, but fear of what you represent. A future where their dominance depends on actual substance instead of repetition. And this is where it becomes clear. That moment wasn't about protection. It was about exposure. It exposed who had been comfortable with your marginalization. It exposed who benefited from the old dynamic. It exposed who assumed silence meant permission. And exposure changes how people behave long after the moment passes. They're watching you now, trying to predict what you'll do next. But the problem is they're still using the wrong model. They think the next move will come from you directly. Another action, another statement, another visible disruption. They don't understand yet that the real shift already happened. The board changed. The pieces didn't. And that misunderstanding is about to cost them. Because while they're focused on you, while they're tracking your expressions, your tone, your timing, they're missing the more dangerous variable entirely. The room itself has changed. The social gravity has shifted. The permissions they relied on are no longer assumed. And once that happens, power stops flowing the way it used to. It starts leaking. Slowly, at first, almost politely, until one day someone realizes decisions aren't landing the way they used to. Instructions don't carry the same weight. Assumptions don't close conversations anymore. That's when panic sets in, because panic is what happens when authority discovers it needs consent. Here's the part they don't want to acknowledge. The person who went to war for you didn't just speak once and disappear back into neutrality. They altered how everyone else is now allowed to think. They created a precedent, and precedent is lethal to fragile hierarchies, because precedent gives other people ideas. It whispers that intervention is possible, that silence is optional, that you don't always have to wait your turn if the turn was never meant to come. That whisper spreads faster than any announcement ever could. Now the room is full of people pretending they don't hear it, while secretly wondering if they should act on it next time. And that internal debate is corrosive. It slows everything down. It creates hesitation where there used to be certainty. And certainty was the only thing holding the structure together. They didn't realize how dependent they were on it until it cracked. You see, systems like this don't collapse because of rebellion. They collapse because of confidence erosion. Because once people see that authority can be challenged cleanly and survive, they start reassessing their own limits. They start noticing where they've been shrinking unnecessarily. They start asking why certain lines existed in the first place. And those questions don't stay theoretical. They show up in meetings, in decisions, in moments where someone pauses instead of complying instantly. That pause is where power goes to die. They're also realizing something else, something deeply uncomfortable. That defense wasn't reactive, it wasn't emotional, it was anticipatory. It came from someone who could see where things were headed and decided to intervene before the damage became obvious to everyone else. That means someone in the room understands trajectories better than they do. Someone who can read future consequences while others are still clinging to past arrangements. And that realization is quietly devastating. Because now the question isn't just, why did they defend you? It's what do they see coming that we don't? And once that question exists, trust in leadership fractures. Not publicly, internally, in the places that matter, people start hedging, preparing contingencies, keeping options open. The room becomes a collection of individuals protecting themselves instead of a unified structure enforcing order. That's when things really start slipping. And all of this is happening while you remain almost offensively calm. You're not escalating. You're not exploiting the moment. You're not acting like someone who just gained leverage. You're acting like someone who always knew this was inevitable. And that demeanor reframes the entire event. It suggests that the defense wasn't a surprise to you either. That it was simply timing, aligning with reality. That's the part that really messes with their heads. Because if you expected this, if you knew someone would eventually draw that line, then what else do you know? What else are you prepared for? What else is already in motion that they haven't clocked yet? Power hates uncertainty, and you've become a walking source of it without doing anything overt. Just by existing differently, just by refusing to react the way they're used to. Now the humor turns even darker. They're trying to restore balance using the same tools that just failed them. More meetings, more alignment conversations, more vague statements about collaboration and shared values. All of it feels hollow now, because everyone remembers the moment when those values were ignored until someone decided they weren't optional anymore. The words don't land. They can't. The spell is broken. They're also quietly monitoring the person who spoke up for you, watching their interactions, analyzing their tone, trying to determine whether that moment was a one-time anomaly or the start of a pattern. Because if it's a pattern, then the power map needs to be redrawn. And redrawing maps means admitting the old ones were wrong. People built careers on those maps, egos, identities, entire self-concepts. That's not something they're eager to confront. So instead they stall, they observe, they delay decisions, they hope momentum will return on its own. But momentum doesn't return after a moment like that. It either transforms or it collapses. There's no rewind, no going back to a version of the room where silence was guaranteed. Everyone knows too much now. And knowledge changes behavior whether people want it to or not. Here's what's really happening beneath all the surface tension. The room is being forced to evolve, and evolution is never comfortable for those at the top. Because evolution redistributes advantage. It rewards awareness over position, substance over performance, quiet capability over loud assertion. And those shifts never benefit the people who were winning under the old rules. You've become a reference point now. Not publicly, not explicitly, but internally. When decisions are made, your name flickers in the background. When judgments are passed, your situation becomes a silent comparison. When someone considers speaking up, they remember what happened when someone did it for you. That memory emboldens them, even if they don't act on it immediately. And emboldenment accumulates. They can feel the timeline accelerating. Not because you're pushing it, but because the structure is under strain. Cracks spread faster than control mechanisms can patch them, and every attempt to suppress the memory of that moment only reinforces its significance. People can't unlearn what they saw. They can't unknow that the hierarchy hesitated, that authority blinked, that protection emerged from an unexpected direction. You should understand this clearly. You didn't gain power in that room. Power was revealed around you. That's a crucial distinction. Gained power can be taken away. Revealed power just changes how the environment behaves. And environments adjust whether anyone approves or not. That's why this feels different. That's why they're uneasy, because this wasn't a negotiation. It was a disclosure. They're starting to sense it now. That the next disruption won't look like conflict either. It won't be loud. It won't be dramatic. It will look like normal operations, slowly failing to produce the same outcomes. Like influence not converting the way it used to. Like authority needing reinforcement instead of being assumed. That's the slow death of dominance, and it's already underway. And here's the part they absolutely don't want to face. You didn't orchestrate this. You didn't manipulate the room into defending you. You simply became someone worth defending without having to ask. And once that happens, the entire dynamic flips. Because protection signals future relevance. It signals investment. It signals that betting against you might be a mistake. And mistakes are expensive in rooms like that. So they'll keep watching you, tracking you, trying to anticipate a move that isn't coming from the place they expect. And while they do, the real consequences of that moment will continue unfolding quietly around them. In delayed decisions, in cautious alliances, in unspoken shifts of loyalty, in people choosing different battles because they don't know where the lines are anymore. They thought someone speaking up for you was an isolated incident, a glitch they could ignore. They don't see yet that it was a signal flare, a warning, a marker of a transition already in progress. And by the time they fully understand what that moment set in motion, The room will be operating under rules they didn't write. And that's where this is heading. Not toward confrontation, not toward spectacle, toward a reality where their old methods simply stop working. Where authority has to justify itself, where silence has to be earned, where people remember that one calm sentence spoken on your behalf and realize the balance of power never really belonged where they thought it did. Because once that realization sets in, the room can't go back to pretending. Pretending requires innocence, and innocence is gone now. Everyone knows too much. Everyone felt the glitch. Everyone remembers the exact second the air shifted and the hierarchy hesitated. And no matter how smoothly they tried to resume business as usual, there's an awareness underneath it all that never shuts off again. The awareness that someone crossed a line for you and nothing collapsed. No lightning strike, no punishment, no immediate consequence, just a quiet redistribution of gravity. That's when the real comedy starts, the dark kind. The kind that plays out slowly, over weeks, over decisions, over subtle misfires in authority. People who used to command rooms find themselves explaining more than they're comfortable with. Instructions start sounding like requests. Requests start sounding like negotiations. Negotiations stall. And nobody can quite explain why everything feels heavier than it used to. They blame timing. They blame complexity. They blame outside factors, anything except the truth. That the room changed allegiance in a way that can't be undone. You see, when someone goes to war for you in a room like that, it doesn't crown you king. It removes your status as collateral damage, and that alone rewires everything. Because once you're no longer expendable, people have to account for you. Not just socially, strategically. They have to factor in the possibility that decisions involving you might trigger resistance they didn't budget for. And that hesitation ripples outward, infecting plans that once felt airtight. They're learning now that power doesn't vanish all at once. It erodes. It becomes inefficient. It requires more effort to achieve the same results, more justification, more alignment meetings, more reassurance. And every extra step is a tax on dominance. They're paying that tax now without fully understanding why. They just know things don't move the way they used to. Doors don't open as easily. Momentum stalls at odd moments. And somewhere in the back of their minds, they know exactly when it started. The truly destabilizing part is that they can't isolate the problem. It's not you. It's not the person who spoke up. It's the precedent, the memory, the proof that intervention is possible, that silence isn't guaranteed, that protection can emerge without warning. Once that proof exists, people start testing it unconsciously. They push back a little more. They hesitate a little longer. They speak a little more plainly. Not because they're brave, but because they've seen the cost of speaking drop. That's how systems fail. Not through rebellion, through normalization of dissent. And that's already underway. They're watching it happen in real time and pretending they're still in control of the pace. They're not. The pace changed the moment someone went to war for you, and nothing bad happened as a result. And you? You're not accelerating it. You're not orchestrating chaos. You're letting entropy do its job. You're moving forward, focused on your own trajectory, while the environment around you adjusts, whether it wants to or not. That restraint reads as confidence, as inevitability, as someone who doesn't need to exploit moments, because moments keep arriving on their own. They're starting to realize that the defense wasn't about you being fragile. It was about you being underestimated. And underestimation is expensive when it comes due, because it means resources were misallocated, Attention was misplaced, risk was misjudged. And now, the correction phase begins. They try to reevaluate you, but it's too late to do it quietly. The room remembers. Everyone saw who stepped in. Everyone felt the shift. Reclassification at this stage requires explanation, and explanations reveal weakness. So instead they hedge, they watch, they delay, they pretend neutrality, while subtly repositioning themselves away from old assumptions. It's clumsy, transparent, almost funny in its desperation, because they're trying to regain control, using the same invisible tools that just failed them. Narrative management, strategic silence, selective acknowledgement. But those tools only work when people believe in them, and belief cracked the moment someone broke ranks for you. Now comes the phase they hate the most, the waiting. Not your waiting, theirs. Waiting to see if another line gets drawn, waiting to see if someone else speaks up next time, waiting to see if the person who defended you does it again, waiting to see if you ever need defending at all. That waiting creates tension, and tension corrodes authority faster than open challenge ever could. You've become a silent reference point now. When people consider decisions, your situation flickers through their minds, not consciously, instinctively, as a reminder that the room isn't what it pretends to be, that alliances aren't as fixed as they appear, that someone unexpected might intervene. That reminder changes behavior even when no one says a word. And here's the part they really can't stomach. You didn't earn this through politics. You earned it through consistency, through not folding, through not performing desperation, through not collapsing when you were meant to, through becoming someone whose trajectory was obvious to the right eyes long before the room caught up. That's the kind of leverage that doesn't announce itself early. It reveals itself suddenly and all at once, usually when it's too late to prevent. They're beginning to understand that the person who spoke up didn't just defend you from something. They defended the future from being distorted by a bad call. They intervened because allowing the old narrative to continue would have been inefficient, short-sighted, maybe even dangerous. That's not sentiment, that's foresight. And foresight always outranks position in the long run. So now the room exists in an awkward in-between state. Too aware to function the old way. Too cowardly to fully adapt. And that limbo is where mistakes multiply. Where authority overreaches, where decisions get made to reassert control instead of optimize outcomes. And those decisions carry consequences. Quiet ones at first. Missed chances, lost trust, gradual erosion of credibility. You're not celebrating any of this. You don't need to. You're watching it with the detached clarity of someone who understands systems. You know what happens when a structure loses its monopoly on silence. You know what happens when people realize they don't have to absorb pressure indefinitely. You know what happens when power is exposed as conditional instead of absolute. It doesn't explode, it decays. And the funniest part, if you're being honest, is how seriously they still take themselves while it's happening. The grand speeches, the strategic memos, the forced confidence, all of it layered over a quiet understanding that the room is no longer theirs alone. That influence is now contested terrain. That the rules they enforced for years were never laws, just habits. They wanted you manageable. They wanted you isolated. They wanted you quiet enough to ignore and useful enough to exploit. And now they're stuck with a reality where you're neither. You're not demanding power. You're not chasing validation. You're not even engaging the dynamic directly. You're simply moving forward, and the environment is rearranging itself around that motion, whether they approve or not. That's the consequence of someone going to war for you in that room. Not applause, not protection forever, but a permanent disruption of the assumption that you're alone. And once that assumption dies, everything built on top of it starts to wobble. They'll try to rewrite the story eventually. They always do. Minimize the moment, reframe the defense as insignificant, attribute it to misunderstanding or timing. But rewrites only work when the audience forgets. And this room won't. Because everyone felt it. Everyone remembers where they were sitting. Everyone remembers who spoke. Everyone remembers the pause that followed. And memory like that doesn't fade. It shapes decisions long after the words are gone. So no, this isn't heading toward confrontation. It's heading toward irrelevance for the methods they relied on. It's heading toward a future where authority has to perform competence instead of entitlement, where silence is no longer free, where protection appears unpredictably, where power dynamics glitch not because someone is loud, but because someone is aligned. They asked themselves the wrong question after that moment. They asked why someone defended you. The real question they should have asked is, what kind of system allows that defense to be so destabilizing in the first place? Because the answer exposes everything they don't want to see. You didn't win a battle. You triggered a recalibration. You didn't rise up. You made the floor unstable. You didn't need to speak. Someone else did it for you. And that single act did more damage to the old order than any confrontation ever could. And that's the part they'll never fully recover from. Because now they know, not intellectually, in their nervous system, that the room is no longer predictable, that silence isn't guaranteed, that loyalty can appear without permission, and that you are no longer a safe variable to underestimate. Someone went to war for you in that room. Everything shifted after that, and no matter how hard they try to move on, they'll always remember the moment they realized the balance of power had already changed, and they were late to noticing it. Ah, there you are. You felt it, didn't you? That strange pressure behind your thoughts. That moment where a passing idea lingered a second longer than it should have. That split second where you realized your mind isn't just wandering lately, it's building. Welcome to the phase nobody warns you about. Not because it's rare, but because most people don't survive it consciously. Right now, you're not just thinking, you're loading something. And the universe is listening way more closely than usual. Which is not comforting. It's fascinating, slightly unhinged, and potentially disastrous if you keep pretending nothing's different. They're not watching you yet. That comes later. What's happening now is quieter. Your thoughts are behaving like instructions. Your emotions are acting like requests. Your casual what-ifs are being treated like commitments. That's why you've been feeling that low-grade tension. Not panic, not excitement, but that eerie sense that something is leaning forward behind the curtain, waiting to see what you'll do next. This is the part where people accidentally create problems and then swear it came out of nowhere. This is also the part where others stumble into breakthroughs and claim they just got lucky. Neither group is telling the full story. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. What have you been mentally rehearsing lately? Not the polished optimism, not the thoughts you'd admit out loud, the real loops. The ones you replay when you're tired, distracted, or alone. Because right now, those loops aren't harmless. They're fertile. They're gaining momentum. They're testing how much reality is willing to bend to accommodate them. And if you're not paying attention, you'll wake up surrounded, by circumstances that look suspiciously like your inner world decided to externalize itself overnight. This is why you need to be careful. Not afraid. Careful. There's a difference. Fear scatters energy. Care sharpens it. And what's moving through you right now is sharp enough to cut in either direction. The energy of creation doesn't discriminate. It doesn't reward morality. It doesn't pause to ask if you're ready. It simply responds efficiently, almost aggressively. Whatever you keep feeding, emotionally, mentally, imaginatively, is being taken seriously. You might already be noticing the speed, how things are responding faster than they used to, how conversations feel loaded, how certain ideas refuse to stay hypothetical. You think about someone and they reach out. You imagine an outcome and the pieces start rearranging themselves without consulting you. You feel irritation and suddenly obstacles appear as if summoned. You feel curiosity and suddenly information finds you. It's subtle enough to dismiss, but persistent enough to feel intentional. That's the danger. And the opportunity. Most people think creation only happens when they're trying to make something happen. When they're visualizing intensely or setting intentions like they're filing paperwork with the cosmos. That's not what this phase is about. This is background creation, passive creation. The stuff that happens while you're telling yourself nothing is happening. The stray thoughts, the emotional residue, the stories you keep telling yourself about how things usually go. That's the raw material being processed right now. No ceremony required. And here's the part that usually irritates people when they finally see it. You don't get to opt out. You can only participate consciously or unconsciously. Either way, the process continues. Ignoring it doesn't stop it. It just hands the steering wheel to whatever habit has the strongest grip on your attention. And habits are lazy. They don't choose what's best. They choose what's familiar. That's why this moment feels contradictory. Calm, but intense. Quiet, but charged. Nothing dramatic is happening on the surface, yet everything feels like it's leaning forward, like the pause before a decision you didn't know you were making. This isn't pressure from outside. This is internal momentum reaching a threshold. And thresholds don't announce themselves politely. They reveal themselves after you've crossed them. You might feel tempted to drift, to daydream more than usual, to mentally rewrite the past or fantasize about different futures. Normally that would just be mental noise. Right now, it's rehearsal. And rehearsals have consequences when the stage lights come on, whether you're ready or not. The energy moving through you doesn't distinguish between deliberate focus and idle imagination. It just multiplies whatever you linger on. This is where people get sloppy. They assume that because they're not doing anything, nothing is being built. They underestimate how powerful repetition is when conditions are right. They underestimate how quickly an idea can turn into a pattern when the environment is cooperative. And right now, the environment is extremely cooperative. You might also notice people around you acting off, responding to you differently, misreading you, overreacting, projecting. That's not random. When your internal state shifts, even subtly, it changes how others orient themselves around you. Some will be drawn in, some will get irritated, some will suddenly reveal exactly where they stand without meaning to. You didn't cause it, you just triggered visibility. And here's the darkly funny part. You're not being asked to do more. You're being asked to stop feeding the wrong things. Which sounds simple until you realize how much of your inner life runs on autopilot, how often you revisit frustration out of habit, how quickly you assume disappointment, how easily you rehearse outcomes you claim you don't want. During low-energy periods, those habits take years to materialize into consequences. Right now, they're on fast forward. This is why people experience sudden turns during phases like this. Sudden success, sudden chaos, sudden clarity, sudden regret, same energy, different focus. Creation doesn't care what you call it. It just responds to what you keep alive. If you're feeling restless, that's normal. Restlessness is often the first symptom of unused potential, realizing it has leverage. Something in you knows it has influence right now, and it doesn't want to waste it. That can feel exhilarating or deeply uncomfortable depending on how honest you are with yourself. Because influence removes excuses. You can't hide behind "nothing I do matters" when evidence starts piling up to the contrary. This is also where people sabotage themselves accidentally. They feel the intensity and try to escape it, distract themselves, numb out, spiral. Anything to avoid the responsibility of precision. But avoidance is still focus. It still feeds something. And during periods like this, even resistance gets amplified. So no, this isn't about forcing positivity or pretending everything is fine. It's about awareness. About noticing where your attention naturally goes when no one is directing it. About catching yourself mid-thought and asking, is this what I want multiplying right now? Because multiplication is happening whether you supervise it or not. And here's the part that separates people who ride this wave from people who get dragged by it. You don't need control, you need clarity. Control tightens, clarity redirects. Control creates tension, clarity creates alignment. Right now, tension will just feed more tension. Alignment, on the other hand, allows creation to organize itself around something coherent. You may feel like something is being cleared out. Old frustrations losing their grip. Old fears feeling less convincing. Or oddly enough, becoming louder right before they fade. That's normal too. Patterns don't disappear quietly. They flare up when they realize they're losing relevance. Don't mistake that for regression. It's often the opposite. What you're standing in right now is not a conclusion. It's a setup, a preparation phase where small internal adjustments have disproportionate external effects. That's why you need to be deliberate without being rigid, observant without being obsessive, curious without being reckless. Because the next part of this isn't about what you create consciously. It's about what emerges when you stop feeding the things that have been quietly draining you for years. When you stop rehearsing limitations out of habit. When you let unfamiliar possibilities take up mental space without immediately shutting them down. And once that starts happening, once you notice how quickly things respond when you shift even slightly, you're going to realize something unsettling and empowering at the same time. This intensity isn't random. It didn't show up to punish you or reward you. It showed up because you're finally capable of handling consequences faster than before. Most people never reach this phase because consequences terrify them. Not the obvious ones, but the subtle ones. The ones that arrive without drama and still change everything. You're different, not because you're fearless, but because you're tired of pretending that nothing you think, feel, or choose really matters. Right now, it matters more than usual. And that realization alone already separates you from most people moving through the world half asleep. What's happening now is refinement. The excess is starting to burn off. Not explosively, methodically. Old emotional habits are losing efficiency. Old coping mechanisms aren't delivering the same comfort. Old narratives feel heavier than they used to. That's not loss, That's incompatibility. You're outgrowing patterns that only existed to help you survive versions of yourself you no longer occupy. This is why some things are starting to irritate you more than they should. Conversations that once felt harmless now feel draining. Environments that once felt neutral now feel loud. People who thrived on your availability are sensing a shift they can't quite name. You're not pulling away intentionally. Your energy is just reallocating. And reallocation always exposes dependencies. Here's the part people rarely acknowledge. When creation energy spikes, it doesn't just build new things. It reveals inefficiencies. It highlights leaks. It shines an unflattering light on where your attention has been going without a return. And once you see those leaks, you can't unsee them. You start noticing how often you give without replenishment. How often you entertain thoughts that never lead anywhere useful. How often you keep doors open out of politeness long after the air stopped circulating. This is not the moment to romanticize struggle. Struggle is not noble here. It's wasteful. Right now, effort without direction just feeds exhaustion faster. Precision matters more than intensity. Awareness matters more than ambition. You don't need to push harder. You need to stop bleeding energy into places that no longer deserve access. And yes, this is where things get uncomfortable. Because some of what you've been feeding isn't external. It's internal loyalty. Loyalty to outdated self-images. Loyalty to stories where you're always the one adapting. Loyalty to versions of yourself that learned to stay small to stay safe. That loyalty once served a purpose. It kept you functional. It kept you moving. But right now, it's costing you momentum. Momentum is the key word here. You're not starting from zero. You're carrying speed. That's why even small internal adjustments are producing noticeable effects. That's why half decisions are suddenly showing consequences. That's why hesitation feels heavier than action. When momentum is present, direction becomes everything. You may notice that certain desires feel sharper now. Less negotiable, less theoretical. You don't just want change. You want alignment. You want coherence between what you think, what you feel, and what you tolerate. And tolerance is the silent architect of outcomes. What you allow repeatedly becomes structure. What you excuse becomes expectation. What you delay addressing eventually demands attention at inconvenient times. This phase is ruthless in a quiet way. It doesn't attack you. It exposes you. It shows you where your words and your inner behavior don't match. And the exposure isn't public. It's internal. You feel it as restlessness, as irritation, as a sense that something is off even when everything looks fine on paper. Pay attention to that feeling. It's not dissatisfaction. It's calibration. Something in you is adjusting its standards. And once standards rise internally, reality has no choice but to respond eventually. The timing is unpredictable. The direction is not. You might also find that opportunities feel different now. Less shiny, more weighted. You're not drawn to everything that promises growth. You're drawn to what feels clean, what feels precise, what doesn't require you to abandon yourself to participate. That's discernment sharpening. And sharpening tools can cut you if you're careless. This is why you need to slow your reactions without slowing your awareness. Snap reactions right now can lock in paths you didn't intend to walk long term. Pauses are powerful here, not avoidance. Pauses, the kind that let you feel whether something expands you or just stimulates you temporarily. Temporary stimulation is seductive during high creation phases. It feels like progress. It feels like movement. But stimulation without alignment burns energy fast and leaves very little behind. Alignment, on the other hand, feels almost boring at first, calm, clear, undramatic, until you realize how much ground it covers quietly. You may be tempted to test this energy, to poke at it, to see how far it goes. That's natural. Curiosity is part of the process. Just understand that experimentation carries more weight right now. Small experiments can snowball quickly, which is exciting and inconvenient, sometimes simultaneously. Notice how your internal dialogue is changing, not louder, sharper. You're catching yourself sooner, interrupting old spirals mid-sentence, questioning assumptions you used to accept automatically. That's not self-doubt, that's self-audit. And audits are how inefficiencies get eliminated. This is also why sleep, dreams, and idle moments may feel more vivid. When conscious distractions quiet down, background processing takes the lead. Insights arrive sideways. Solutions show up without formal invitations. Don't dismiss them because they didn't arrive through effort. Effort is not the only currency here. The mistake people make in phases like this is trying to define everything too quickly. Labeling, categorizing, explaining. That urge to box things in is a control reflex. Control reduces uncertainty, but it also reduces potential. Right now, potential thrives in space, in allowing things to develop without immediately forcing meaning onto them. You don't need to understand everything that's happening to cooperate with it. You just need to notice what feels draining versus what feels stabilizing. Notice what requires you to shrink versus what allows you to stay intact. Notice what you feel compelled to chase versus what seems to meet you halfway. That distinction matters now more than ever, because chasing creates friction, meeting creates flow. And flow during periods like this compounds faster than effort ever could. You may feel like certain doors are closing without discussion. That's not punishment, that's filtration. When your internal state shifts, anything incompatible naturally loses access, sometimes quietly, sometimes abruptly. Either way, the result is the same: less noise, more signal. And with more signal comes responsibility. Not responsibility in the heavy sense, responsibility in the sense of authorship. You're beginning to realize that you're not just reacting anymore. You're shaping, even when you're not trying to. Especially when you're not trying to. That realization can feel isolating, because it means you can't fully relate to people who insist nothing they do matters, who blame randomness for patterns they refuse to examine, who treat their inner world like a junk drawer and wonder why their external life feels cluttered. You don't need to confront them. You don't need to explain yourself. Explanation dissipates energy here. Presence does more. Your shifts will speak for themselves, and not everyone will like what they hear. This is where discernment becomes protection, not walls, filters. You're learning where to place your attention so it multiplies something useful instead of something familiar. That learning curve is steep, but it's temporary. Once the calibration stabilizes, things feel simpler, cleaner, less effortful. But before that happens, there's a narrowing, a period where options feel fewer but more meaningful, where distractions lose their appeal, where you start choosing depth over breadth without consciously deciding to. That narrowing is not contraction, it's focus. And focus, right now, is the difference between accidentally recreating old cycles and allowing something entirely different to take shape. You may notice that your patience is changing, not thinning, clarifying. You're less willing to explain yourself, less interested in justifying boundaries, less motivated to keep things afloat that require constant emotional maintenance. That's not coldness, that's efficiency. And efficiency is a natural side effect of heightened creation energy. Waste becomes intolerable when output accelerates. This is also where guilt tries to sneak in, wearing familiar disguises. The urge to soften your standards so others don't feel uncomfortable. The temptation to second-guess clarity because it might inconvenience someone else. Watch that impulse carefully. Right now, guilt is often just misdirected loyalty. Loyalty to older versions of relationships that were built around your availability rather than your alignment. Notice how some people respond when you stop overextending. Some will respect it instantly. Others will push. Others will suddenly become dramatic, confused, or distant. None of those reactions require your correction. They're information, clean, unfiltered data about who is benefiting from your diffusion versus who can meet you at your current level of focus. This narrowing also applies internally. Certain thought patterns don't survive scrutiny anymore. You catch exaggerations faster. You question emotional assumptions sooner. You're less willing to spiral just because a thought is loud. That doesn't mean emotions disappear. It means they stop running the entire operation unchecked. And here's something most people misunderstand. Focus doesn't make life rigid. It makes it responsive. When your attention isn't fragmented, you can adapt faster. You can pivot without panic. You can notice subtle shifts before they become crises. Fragmentation, on the other hand, creates the illusion of flexibility while actually slowing everything down. Right now, you're becoming more responsive by becoming more selective. That's why your tolerance for nonsense is dropping. That's why forced conversations feel heavier. That's why environments that don't support clarity feel draining almost immediately. Your nervous system is recalibrating to efficiency, and inefficiency feels like static. You might feel a strange combination of calm and urgency. Calm because you're not scrambling. Urgency because you can feel momentum building and you don't want to misdirect it. That combination is rare. Most people only feel one or the other. When both are present, it means something is lining up internally that hasn't before. This is also where people often ask the wrong question. They ask, "What should I do?" That's a low-quality question right now. Action will reveal itself naturally once focus stabilizes. The better question is, what am I still feeding that doesn't belong in the next version of my life? That question removes more obstacles than any action plan ever could. Because creation energy doesn't just add, it amplifies. And amplification without discernment magnifies clutter just as easily as it magnifies progress. If your internal environment is crowded, things feel chaotic fast. If it's clean, things organize themselves with minimal effort. You may notice that some desires you thought were essential are quietly dissolving, not with drama, with indifference. They simply don't grip you the same way. That's not loss, that's recalibration. Desire isn't disappearing, it's refining, becoming less about compensation and more about expression. This is why chasing feels wrong right now. Not because ambition is bad, but because misaligned ambition wastes too much energy. What feels right is attraction without strain. Movement that doesn't require you to override your instincts to maintain it. Progress that doesn't demand self-betrayal as an entry fee. You're also learning the difference between pressure and pull. Pressure feels urgent but draining. Pull feels calm but persistent. Pressure screams. Pull doesn't need to. During this phase, Following pressure leads to exhaustion. Following pull leads to unexpected efficiency. And yes, this can feel lonely at times. Not because you're isolated, but because fewer things resonate deeply. Surface-level engagement loses its grip. You're not interested in being everywhere. You're interested in being effective. That shift alone changes your entire relationship with time. Time starts behaving differently when focus sharpens. Hours stretch or compress, depending on alignment. Tasks that used to feel heavy move faster. Things that once filled your day lose their hold. You're not managing time anymore. You're allocating attention, and attention is the real currency here. Be mindful of what you consume during this period. Not just media, but conversations, environments, emotional exchanges. Consumption is creation's quiet partner. What you take in influences what you produce, even if you don't notice it consciously. Right now, influence travels fast. You don't need to eliminate everything. Extremes create backlash. What matters is awareness. Noticing how you feel after interactions. Noticing whether something stabilizes you or scatters you. That feedback is reliable right now. Trust it. You may also find yourself less interested in explaining your internal process to others. That's wise. Some things need time to solidify before they can be articulated. Premature explanation diffuses energy. Let your changes become undeniable before they become discussable. This narrowing phase doesn't last forever. It's transitional. It's the compression before expansion takes a new shape. Think of it as a period where loose ends are being quietly removed, so momentum can move cleanly forward. It feels restrictive only if you're still attached to noise. Once focus stabilizes, creation becomes less volatile and more intentional. But you're not there yet. You're in the calibration window, where attention is powerful but still sensitive, where habits are being rewritten, where small choices carry disproportionate weight. This is why awareness matters more than confidence right now. Confidence without awareness becomes reckless. Awareness without confidence becomes hesitation. You're learning to balance both, to act without rushing, to pause without stalling, to choose without second-guessing. And here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. When creation energy is this strong, the environment starts responding before you feel ready. Opportunities appear that test your clarity. Distractions present themselves as rewards. Old patterns knock politely, pretending they've changed. That's not sabotage, that's examination. Examinations aren't meant to trick you. They reveal what you've actually internalized versus what you've just intellectually understood. And right now, your responses matter more than your intentions. So if things feel a little stripped down, a little quieter, a little more focused than usual, that's not a warning sign. That's preparation. Something is consolidating. Something is organizing itself around the version of you that's emerging instead of the one that was convenient to keep around. And once that consolidation completes, once focus locks in fully, the pace changes again. The responsiveness increases, the feedback loop tightens, and that's when creation stops feeling abstract and starts feeling undeniable. This is the moment people usually misinterpret. They assume the intensity means they should rush, that they should hurry up and make something happen before the window closes. That instinct is understandable. It's also the fastest way to misfire. High creation energy doesn't reward speed. It rewards accuracy. It responds to precision, not panic. The reason you're being asked to be careful right now is not because danger is approaching, but because your influence has increased. When influence increases, mistakes carry more weight. Not dramatic mistakes, subtle ones. The kind that don't look like errors until you're living inside their consequences. You may notice that what you say casually seems to land harder than before. Words stick, opinions echo. Offhand comments take on lives of their own. That's not coincidence. That's leverage showing itself. Your presence is carrying more signal than noise, which means everything you put out has more traction. This is not the time to speak carelessly or entertain thoughts just because they're familiar. Familiarity does not equal truth, and right now, truth organizes reality faster than comfort ever could. There's also something else happening beneath the surface. You're becoming more aware of your internal timing. When to move, when to pause, when to wait without stagnating. That sense doesn't come from logic. It comes from alignment between thought, emotion, and instinct. When those three stop fighting each other, decisions become cleaner. You don't need elaborate justifications. You don't need consensus. You feel the click when something is right, and the drag when it isn't. This is why things are about to get super interesting. Not because chaos is coming, but because clarity is. And clarity has a way of rearranging everything that relied on confusion to survive. Relationships built on imbalance feel awkward. Goals built on compensation feel hollow. Habits built on avoidance feel exhausting. None of this is punishment. It's exposure. And exposure is uncomfortable only if you insist on holding on to what's being outgrown. You might feel moments of sudden certainty followed by moments of doubt. That oscillation is normal. It's not regression. It's calibration. Think of it as your internal compass adjusting to a stronger magnetic field. The needle wobbles before it settles. If you try to force it, you slow the process. If you observe it, it stabilizes faster. Right now, observation is power. Watching your reactions, watching what triggers urgency, watching what creates calm. Those observations are not passive, they're active data collection. And data, when interpreted honestly, prevents unnecessary detours. You don't need to fix everything. You need to notice everything that consistently pulls you off center. This is also where dark humor sneaks in. Whether you like it or not, you start seeing the absurdity of old patterns. How much effort went into maintaining things that never really worked. How serious you were about problems that evaporate the moment you stop feeding them. You might catch yourself laughing internally at situations that once felt heavy. That's not dismissal, that's detachment. And detachment frees energy without requiring bitterness. Be careful not to confuse detachment with indifference. Indifference numbs, detachment clarifies. You still care, you just don't cling. You don't chase outcomes to feel complete. You don't grip scenarios to feel safe. You let things reveal what they are without forcing them to become what you hoped. That shift alone changes everything. As this intensity continues, you'll notice that creation becomes less about imagining and more about selecting. Options appear, but not all of them deserve attention. Some are distractions dressed up as opportunities. Some are tests disguised as rewards. The difference isn't how they feel over time. Distractions excite quickly and drain steadily. Aligned paths may feel understated at first, but they build momentum without friction. This is where patience becomes a strategic advantage. Not passive waiting, active restraint. Choosing not to react to every impulse. Choosing not to chase every possibility. Choosing to let things develop one layer deeper before engaging. Restraint right now is not limitation, it's direction. You may also feel a growing intolerance for self-deception. Small lies you tell yourself to stay comfortable start to feel abrasive. You can't unknow what you know anymore. And that's a good thing, even when it's inconvenient. Knowledge creates responsibility, but it also creates freedom. Freedom from cycles that only persist because they're never questioned. This is the phase where you realize that creation isn't about adding more to your life. It's about subtracting what doesn't belong, so what does belong has room to expand. Expansion without space just creates pressure. Space without expansion creates stagnation. Right now, both are happening in sequence. Clearing, then building, quietly, efficiently. Be mindful of how you frame your experiences during this period. The stories you tell yourself are blueprints. If you frame challenges as confirmation that something is wrong, you reinforce resistance. If you frame them as adjustments, you cooperate with refinement. Language matters more than usual because language shapes interpretation, and interpretation directs energy. You might notice that your tolerance for chaos drops. Not external chaos necessarily, but internal disorganization, scattered thoughts, emotional clutter, unfinished loops. These start demanding closure. You feel an urge to resolve, not because you're impatient, but because unresolved energy feels heavier now. Resolution frees capacity. Capacity allows creation to flow without obstruction. This is also why boundaries feel easier to enforce. Not because you've become harder, but because you've become clearer. Clear boundaries don't require aggression. They're communicated through consistency, through what you respond to and what you don't, through where you place your attention and where you withdraw it. Attention is endorsement right now. Use it deliberately. You may find that people project more onto you during this phase. Their expectations, their assumptions, their fears. That's not your responsibility to manage. Projection intensifies when someone senses coherence they don't yet have. Stay grounded. Don't absorb what isn't yours. Reflection is not absorption. As the pace increases, synchronicities may feel less like surprises and more like confirmations. Things line up not because you asked for them explicitly, but because your internal state is finally compatible with them. Compatibility is underrated. It's not about desire, it's about readiness. And readiness isn't something you declare, it's something demonstrated through behavior. This is where care becomes essential. Care in what you agree to, care in what you tolerate, care in what you rehearse mentally, care in what you dismiss. Every choice is a vote, not just for outcomes, but for identity. Who you are becoming is being reinforced through repetition right now, faster than usual. You might feel tempted to explain this process to others, to justify your shifts, to narrate your evolution. Resist that urge. Explanation dissipates energy. Integration concentrates it. Let your actions speak. Let your consistency communicate. The people who need explanations are rarely the ones who understand them anyway. As this phase unfolds, you'll notice that some desires sharpen while others dissolve. That's discernment refining itself. Desire without clarity creates chaos. Clarity without desire creates stagnation. You're learning to hold both without forcing either. That balance is rare, and it's the reason things are about to get interesting in ways you can't fully predict yet. There will be moments where you feel ahead of yourself, moments where you wonder if you're imagining the acceleration. Those moments pass quickly once results begin to surface. Not necessarily dramatic results, subtle shifts, easier movement, cleaner decisions, fewer internal debates. Those are the real indicators that creation is responding. Be careful with impatience. Impatience doesn't speed things up. It distorts perception. It makes you overlook incremental progress because it doesn't match imagined timelines. Timelines are flexible right now. Direction is not. Stay oriented toward what feels coherent, not what feels urgent. You may also notice an increase in personal accountability. You catch yourself faster when you slip into old habits. You correct course sooner. That's not self-criticism, that's self-respect. Respect for your own capacity to influence outcomes. Respect for the energy moving through you. As creation becomes undeniable, you'll realize that power doesn't feel like domination. It feels like responsibility without burden. Choice without confusion. Movement without force. That's the paradox most people miss. Real influence is quiet because it doesn't need to announce itself. It shows up in results. This is why the warning matters. Be careful. Not because something bad is looming, but because something powerful is active. Power amplifies whatever it touches. Treated casually, it creates mess. Treated deliberately, it creates momentum that feels almost unfair in its efficiency. You're not meant to isolate during this phase, but you are meant to be selective. Connection that supports clarity accelerates growth. Connection that feeds confusion drains it. Choose accordingly. You don't need to cut ties dramatically. Distance often establishes itself naturally when alignment shifts. As you move forward, trust the signals you're receiving from your own experience. The sense of rightness, the subtle resistance, the quiet pull. Those signals are accurate right now. Doubting them out of habit only delays what's already organizing itself. This period won't last forever. The intensity will stabilize, the sensitivity will ease. But what you establish now sets the tone for what follows. This is a foundation phase disguised as a quiet stretch. Miss it, and you recreate old patterns at higher volume. Use it, and you step into a level of coherence that makes progress feel almost effortless. So yes, be careful, be aware, be precise. Because the energy of creation is very intense right now. Not loud, not chaotic. Intense in the way a focused beam is intense. And once you align with it fully, once you stop feeding what drains you and start cooperating with what stabilizes you, things don't just change. They rearrange themselves around who you've become. And that's when you realize the warning was never about fear. It was about readiness.